So my guest is Dr. Philip Tallon, and Philip is the author of both the Poetics of Evil and the Absolute Basics of the Christian Faith. He's also the chair of Apologetics at Houston Baptist. So it's good to have you on, and welcome to the podcast. Teach cultural apologetics at HBU, and that, you teach a lot of different apologetics, but specifically, you do a lot of the classes in cultural apologetics at HBU, and so I know you teach some classes where you explore art, film, literature. I was in one of those classes over the summer, so that was kind of neat. It's kind of a different side of apologetics that, we hear a lot of the philosophical apologetics, but cultural is a little different. So we're going to talk a little bit about a unique aspect of cultural apologetics in film today. So we're talking about something that maybe most Christians would at least pause to talk about, and maybe even they write it off or think it's taboo, and that is horror films. Horror films. So I guess we'll jump right in. Why should Christians watch horror films, or at least not write them off?
That's a question that I get a lot, and I think I like the way that you've kind of qualified that. So, should seems like a bit of a command there. There's some obligation to do so, and so typically with obligatory actions, they're right to do and wrong not to do. I don't think people are wrong not to watch horror films, and heartily encourage people to follow their conscience, as well as, a lot of people just have, they talk about being afraid of, taking a shower after watching Psycho, or, afraid of going in the ocean after watching Jaws. And one doesn't want to scare people off of doing wholesome and good things. So, there's no command there to watch horror films. But if somebody does have the temperament for them, then I think that there's a lot of value to be gained. And so I would want to argue against somebody who says that Christians shouldn't watch horror films, right? I think this is an optional thing, which is to say that it can be right to do and not wrong not to do. And so you can just, you can watch these movies as your conscience and temperament dictates. Now, the value, to some degree, watching horror films is the same value as you might get, engaging in any other form of culture, right? You kind of learn more about what's going on, sort of art that people are consuming. You become culturally literate, something that's important to many people. And so those of us who are interested in pop culture, so I teach a course on film, visual arts, and apologetics. A lot of it's about pop culture, right? Because it's a powerfully shaping force in our world. I think almost all of us are, kind of enmeshed in it. So we want to understand what's going on there, and so that's a value. And I think and horror films are part of that, and seem to be increasingly becoming a part of the film landscape critically. So you've got horror films, recognized at the Oscars recently. So Jordan Peele's film Get Out, was nominated, I think, for best screenplay, deservedly so. And you get, a lot of indie horror now is kind of attracting the attention of mainstream film critics, where, as opposed to when I grew up, and perhaps when you grew up, you're a lot younger than I am, Clark. But when I grew up, people viewed horror to some degree just as the kind of garbage that some people seem to enjoy, but which had really no value, perhaps except for a few of these kind of, culturally accepted horror films, movies like The Shining or Rosemary's Baby or something like that. And so now we're in a place where horror films are getting a lot of attention. And so, Ari Aster is a new horror filmmaker. His recent release, Midsummer, had a lot of the cultural conversation around it. People are interested in talking about it. It's, in a sense, as big a release as any other Hollywood movie. It's getting as much critical attention. It's not getting quite the same box office as Infinity War was, but people are engaged with it. And so if you see, being engaged with, understanding, exegeting culture as part of your calling, part of the thing that you should do, then I think horror is at least worth attention. But more than that, I think there are some specific things that horror does that are actually quite unique in the pop culture landscape and can really be quite illuminating if we are willing to wade through, as it were, the darkness of the films, themselves. And so I think there's a lot to see there in this darkness that horror films conjure. And so for those who don't just want to kind of know what's going on, but who actually want to really, kind of think about works of art, I think horror films are really rich texts very often to consider.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. You mentioned that some of the audience for horror maybe not the most popular level audience. The box office movies are your superhero films, your action films, your comedy films. Horror seems to be a more specific genre of people. And you were writing an article recently along with Cameron McAllister for the Unexpected Journal, which is a really, really neat journal that a few of our students at HBU put together. But you said this about some of those films that are a little more popular. You talked specifically about like the film Ted 2, Deadpool. You mentioned James Bond. And these are films that are a little more acceptable in genre. So you say they belong to more socially acceptable genres like comedy, action, reality TV, and their antics get a free pass, whereas anything in the horror category is often regarded as guilty by association. Yet many horror films consistently do the one thing that our other popular entertainers refuse to do, namely take evil seriously. They frequently move beyond trivialization to the much-needed moral wrestling match. So maybe you could expound on that a little bit. I think that was a really good quote, but talk a little bit about the way that horror movies actually address evil as opposed to more popular level genres.
Yeah, well, part of the point we're making there obviously is that, horror seems to have this special pride of place or shame of place in our pop culture landscape as being the one genre where people will say, oh, I don't watch that kind of thing. That's just, you shouldn't watch that. It's a whole genre, a whole section of the video store when I was growing up. That's the bad section. Or maybe a whole category on Netflix now. Just these things are kind of out of bounds. And part of the point we're making there is that in that article is there are a lot of other genres of movie making that they get a bit more of a pass. People just kind of accept them without much consideration. But that doesn't mean that they're really any more kind of ethically commendable. So Ted, made by Seth MacFarlane, or kind of other trivial comedies sometimes just sort of float by. People don't take them too seriously, and so they don't wrestle really with some of the issues that are bringing up, or even some of the problems they're in. But one really unique thing about horror is that it's trying, as it were, to kind of get into our faces and be confrontational. It actually, whereas I don't know, you can watch some true crime TV show on any night of the week, and all these awful things are happening, but it doesn't really, not really disturbing in some way. You're just kind of, it's presented as entertainment. Or you watch action movie, many people die in front of you as the hero bravely guns them down, taking out the bad guys. I watch these kind of movies and TV shows. I'm not saying that people shouldn't, but they go down so easily we may not really kind of think about their content. And horror is sort of the exception, that it disturbs us, it confronts us, it's sort of rude in a sense as a work of art, and there's a real value in that, and that it's going to kind of unsettle us and kind of press into our faces something that we perhaps ought to think about. And specifically, the thing that horror pushes into our faces is evil, right? And by evil, I have a very sort of Augustinian definition, which is to say that the evil is a kind of a lack of some good that should be there. So it's a disruption of the moral order, or the natural order, or the social order, or something like that. There should be this kind of thing that we all know roughly should be there, but it's like it's not there. It's twisted in this really strange way, and so it's going to kind of upset us in a way that perhaps can just affect our emotions. That's why a lot of people don't like it. It also then prove to be a really kind of rich object for reflection. Well, why is this so disturbing to us? Like, what is it about this film that's upsetting? What's the good, as it were, that's lacking? Again, going back to this Augustinian idea, what's the good that's lacking? That should be there, right? You can kind of reflect in this way, and then there's an additional kind of effect, perhaps, which is that horror movies, because they're intentionally violating by nature, they're trying to kind of violate our sense of security and safety and so forth. They also are often to kind of explore questions in a way that entertainment that's really trying to please a really wide audience tends to brush over. So horror movies are often the most explicitly religious of any genre. They're actually dealing with kind of religious imagery, religious possibilities, religious figures, but they're often confronting big cultural issues, and they don't have to, because their goal is to upset us to some degree, to make us afraid. They don't have to resolve some of these tensions in the way that a lot of other popular entertainment does. And so perhaps we all have a friend in our lives who is the kind of friend you're a little bit worried when your other friends are around what he or she is going to say, because they just sort of like say whatever. And there's a real value though in kind of people like that, which is that they're just willing to sort of say the uncomfortable thing, even at the expense of kind of our social ease. And horror is a bit like that friend sometimes. Maybe you don't want to you don't want him to give the toast at your wedding, but you do want to kind of hear what he has to say, because he's going to kind of tell you the truth even if you don't want to hear it. And so there's a sense in which not all horror movies are like this. There's a sense in which some horror movies, I think, can really provide that benefit for us.
Right. Yeah. And I think one of those uncomfortable realities, and it's in the title of the article you wrote with Cameron, is eternal consequences. And we don't stop to talk about eternal consequences. And the one place where we should talk about that the most is, in the church. And we sometimes just kind of push that to the side and don't always talk about the eternal consequences. And horror addresses that, pretty right on. In fact, one of the movies that has always stuck with me is the Exorcist film, which I personally would tell people don't watch it, but I can't really say that because whenever I was real young, I watched The Exorcist. It was one of my first horror movies, and I saw it because I was interested in a girl at the time, and so I went and watched The Exorcist with her. And I was, just a preteen boy that just, hadn't seen anything in his life. And I saw The Exorcist, and it scarred me. And then I had to go home, and, my parents didn't allow me to watch, those, especially R-rated films as a whole, but The Exorcist would have been a no-no. So then I had to go home and debate, do I tell my parents I saw The Exorcist, and, maybe they can comfort me or allow me to make a place in their room for the night, or do I face the demons that might be in my closet? And honestly, I thought I'm going to stick with the demons and face the demons rather than tell my parents.
Yeah. How do I ask if I can sleep, on a little cot at the foot of their bed without revealing that I just saw this movie I wasn't supposed to?
That's right. Well, interestingly enough, that was a novel by William Blatty, and he did an interview with Terry Mattingly. And he said this, he said, I knew what I wanted to do, the writer of the Exorcist novel. I wanted to make a statement that the grave is not the end, that there is more to life than death, And he added, my logic was simple. If demons are real, why not angels? If angels are real, why not souls? And if souls are real, what about your own soul? So I thought that was a interesting take on the Exorcist film, because here we are being presented with an uncomfortable truth. It's that friend that we don't want to, we don't want him to say the truth, but it's there. It's right there in your face. That you watch that movie and you go, wow, evil exists. This is evil. And so, how can horror movies use evil to actually defend God's existence, or at least maybe present a case for life beyond the grave?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that's a great point, and I know that for some people, actually, for Cameron McAllister, my co-writer, his father speaks about The Exorcist as having largely this effect on him, which is to say that he realized that this movie was presenting him with possibilities that perhaps he believed in but hadn't really taken seriously, and so if he's genuinely frightened by the possibility of demonic possession, then this conjures a whole world of possibilities. And I think Stephen King, at one point in his book on horror, Danse Macabre, he says something like, well, people say they're not afraid of, ghosts or spirits or whatever. And, but I just challenge them, like, go watch a scary movie and go find that abandoned house in town, the one everybody stays away from, go kind of break in the rotted back door, go up in the attic and sit there from midnight to 3 and tell me if you're not genuinely afraid of, something evil coming after you. The idea there being that in some sense, horror reawakens our imaginations to the possibility of, unseen forces, things beyond kind of our, just experience of day-to-day life, things that, we deny are true when the lights are on and, we're out in public, but, perhaps in our hearts fear are possible. And so it can affect our heart in that way, right? So I'm sure horror movies have led many people to pray more than they had otherwise, perhaps after you saw The Exorcist, you went back in your room and you genuinely prayed, like, God, just please protect me from any of this stuff. So I think that there is that imaginative benefit, as it were, which is to say that, horror movies can kind of open the dark closet door at midnight again, to a sort of a possibility that, has become very culturally remote. We don't take the devil as seriously as did our ancestors, but there's a potentially a real value there. And then of course, if you're open to that possibility, then you can kind of follow Blatty's line of thinking. And Blatty is quite eager to actually use a novel to kind of reinvest a real sense of fear and possibility of demonic possession. He believes this is real. But there's a recent movie that, not that recent, but fairly recent movie that plays with this idea. So The Exorcism of Emily Rose. I don't know if you've seen it. It's a film directed by a Christian filmmaker, Scott Derrickson, who's gone on to direct Doctor Strange and other things. He's an excellent filmmaker, but he kind of plays with the idea of, what's if horror really scares you, if the possibility of demons really scare you, how certain can you be of your unbelief in the spiritual realm? And so in that movie, the whole thing centers around a legal trial between where there's a priest on trial who basically was in charge of an exorcism. Of course, the exorcism immediately thereafter, the patient, as it were, died. And so he's then on trial basically for medical malpractice. If somebody's dealing with a serious ailment, is a priest the right one to call? Like, basically, is exorcism ever, as it were, the appropriate medicine for someone's diagnosis? And there's a fundamentally religious question, a theological question, like, are demons real? Like, is this something that we actually need to worry about? And so he's on trial. There are, two kind of lawyers battling back and forth, one of whom is a skeptic, but who through the course of the film then, encounters these strange things. At 3 a.m., clock begins to misbehave and demons are sort of lurking around. We see this in the movie. This is a real possibility. And throughout this whole trial, she becomes less certain of her naturalism, becomes more open to the possibility of supernatural. Very last scene in the movie, she goes home, she see her clock by the side of the bed, the clock that's, whose misbehavior is the sign of demonic possession. She turns it around to the wall, turns the other way. Mm. She has become sufficiently uncertain, as it were, of her naturalism that, she's now a little afraid of this possibility. Back to that King quote I shared earlier. Okay, so maybe she's not so certain. But then there's an additional effect, right? Which is that, now when I go home after watching the movie, I lay down in bed and I look at my clock, now I'm suddenly in the same place, right? If this movie is affecting me, as it were, by presenting me with the possibility of there being unseen things that are surround us, right? Unseen realities that can affect us and harm us. If I take this seriously, then there may be even good reason to be at least partly afraid, of such possibilities. And so I think horror certainly doesn't always have this effect, but it can, as it were, reawaken our imagination to certain truths that we've kind of forgotten or shoved into the bottom drawer and left aside.
Yeah, that's interesting because today naturalism or materialism is pretty popular, and so it makes you wonder, those that claim to be just specifically a materialist, meaning that no spiritual things at all exist or no supernatural forces are at work. I love that Stephen King quote because I've thought about that myself. I don't know how you would lock that person in an abandoned hospital overnight and see how comfortable they are. It's just it's kind of a hard thing horror movies bring us to that place where we have to confront the supernatural, especially these specific type of films. Which leads me to another question.
Sorry, before you go on to that, there's one other thing I forgot about. We taught I taught this class on film, visual art, and apologetics. You were in it, and in the course of talking about horror, I should mention that one of your fellow students, perhaps you remember this, began using horror in a sense as a conversation opener for people. So do you remember her posting about this? She she began asking people, what do you like? Do you like movies? You like horror movies? So then she used this as an entree about if you like horror movies, do you think that there's really such a thing as true evil, right? Do you think that such a thing as true evil exists, like objective evil, we might say? Not that evil is a substance. Christian theology has typically denied that, but just that there are things that we can say, yes, that's evil, right? That's and so she's been using this as a conversation starter, with various people as a kind of an unusual way into talking about, well, okay, so if you think that there are sort of things that are objectively wrong, you think things that are objectively right, and kind of having this discussion about morality, where do we get this intuition that certain things are wrong or right from? And so it's wound up being a really successful way for her to open up, spiritual conversations. Even to the point that she said she's having this conversation with her Uber driver, and they're just kind of going back and forth. And the Uber driver realized, oh my goodness, I haven't been taking, my faith seriously. I need to, think more seriously about these things. So she kind of followed, as it were, that William Peter Blatty line of, well, if I think demons are real, then, I think got to think something kind of good spiritual forces are real. And if souls exist, then, then I have a soul. And what am I doing?
Right. Right.
And so there. Now, I'm not saying this is going to replace the Roman road for evangelism techniques, but it is one of those things that I think people who are interested in culture, interested in movies, it's a good avenue for discussion.
Our podcast today is brought to you by Anchor Podcast. If you're interested in podcasting and you're really not sure where to get started, Anchor is the place to go. It's very simple. You just upload your audio to anchor.fm, and Anchor will do the rest of the work for you. They will put you on major podcasting platforms, as well as they will find you sponsors so you can make some money. So Anchor Podcast is the way to go. So thanks and special shout out to our sponsor, Anchor Podcast. We're also brought to you today by Skillshare. Skillshare is a place for those willing to learn. Whatever you'd like to learn, whether it be photography, cinema, social media, business, marketing, advertising, fashion, cooking, music, you name it, Skillshare has it, and it's the place to go. So you can find Skillshare today by clicking the link below to get 2 months free. That's right, we'll give you 2 months free of Skillshare. Just click the link below to find out more. Well, we've been talking a lot about specific horror movies that portray spiritual things or evil things or supernatural things. Are there movies, you could probably answer this, are there movies that are a little too far? Maybe they don't have a proper use for the Christian out there that wants to, there's other movies out there such as Saw, for example, where it's you're an hour or two of someone being tortured or people being tortured, and it's almost like a, just kind of odd thing. Just it's not a spiritual movie in any case. But are there movies that are too far that maybe, we talked at the beginning, we don't want to say that this is the command that you should follow, but is there a line? I guess is what I'm getting at for horror films.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a perennial question when you talk about this, and a lot of times people just kind of go, well, there's a line and I know where it is, and that line is right here. It's my level of comfort. And so, I do think that there's a place for a certain amount of freedom, of discernments for, folks to make these kind of choices. So for instance, I've seen Saw. I don't think that Saw is actually a necessarily reprehensible film. It's actually kind of a fairly charmingly made horror movie in a certain way. No, I'm not. I haven't watched any of the other ones. I'm not super eager. I'm like, okay, I get the idea. I thought it was a well executed thing. I don't need to continually kind of return to it. And so there is I think there is a little bit of a trap sometimes in with people who are interested in horror movies, that they then kind of keep, this becomes the main thing they watch. And to some degree, in order to be kind of innovative and interesting, a lot of that depends on, being kind of more and more shocking and kind of disgusting and, horrible. And so there's a way you can obviously kind of if you, with a kind of unbalanced taste, as it were, kind of fall down the rabbit hole of, one particular line of genre, and then kind of, keep pursuing more and more extreme versions of that. And so some of what's needed, of course, is the proper development of what I call just taste. And by taste, I mean, kind of a aesthetic appreciation that's also combined with, holistic understanding of what's good for people, right? So, our tastes are not just dictated by what we think is the absolute best art, but also by the art in purely aesthetic terms, but also art that actually sort of connects with, as it were, deep values. And so, Christians will necessarily have, as it were, kind of a distinctive taste from unbelievers, because we have, certain values, certain things are very important, important to us. And as it were, we may be more aware, as it were, of the kind of beauty of certain sorts of stories. And so I do want for Christians to have, as a sense, distinctive taste. And I do think that part of a distinctively Christian taste is that we gravitate toward the beautiful and the good and the true, and we want to understand these things. And so if I met a person who only watched horror movies, every single kind of horror movie, I would have defective taste in some way. And I think the best way to combat bad taste or deficient taste is not with sheer kind of moralism. You've gone too far. Here's the line, and you've crossed it. But rather with sort of supplementing, as it were, that taste with good things. If you can't watch a beautiful movie, a movie that has no violence in it, a movie that's about compassion, if you can't watch a story like that with enjoyment, then there's really something wrong with you, And so horror movies, I think, can be part of a Christian's well-balanced diet, but they probably gravitate a little more toward the top of the food pyramid, right? These aren't the vegetables or the meats. These are more like the sweets, and so you don't want to spend your whole diet focusing on such things. And I think if you keep a well-balanced diet, as it were, kind of properly balanced taste, then you'll just naturally kind of avoid things that you just know, hey, there's really no kind of redeeming value in this. So this
Mm-hmm.
is a discussion that I actually am currently having with my co-writer, because we're sort of asking the question like, well, what do we need to watch, right? Do we need to watch everything?
Mm-hmm.
Because there's some movies I've avoided, right?
Right.
And some movies I don't really particularly care to see. And so we were talking about um, a film called Hostel. I'm sure you're familiar with. Maybe some
Mm-hmm.
of the viewers are familiar with. Um, yeah, do we need to watch Hostel? It seems like it's kind of relevant to this chapter. I had never seen it, which I'm sure horror fans. Does this guy know that he doesn't seen Hostel? And so my co-writer went back and he rewatched it, and he's like, this movie is actually really not that valuable. Like, it's not that good, and it's not doesn't really have anything kind of important. So, and it's just kind of all this awfulness, and so you can skip it. Um, so we're still trying to protect our sensibilities, as it were, and keep a properly balanced artistic diet. And I do think that then kind of helps to let us kind of discern, as it were, what's really worthwhile and what's not. And so I'm wary of folks who watch nothing but horror movies, as much as I'm wary of people who play nothing but Candy Crush, or watch nothing but news channels. Like, I think
Mm-hmm.
you're not really kind of directing your loves properly if you're stuck only in one groove or one type of entertainment.
Yeah, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. My wife and I, we watch. She's kids movie fan, so about as far as she gets is Secret Life of Pets and things of that nature. So, when I was preparing for our talk, I wanted to watch the film that you and Cameron wrote a lot about in the article, The Witch. And
Mm-hmm.
first off, just watching the film, it was a powerful film as far as the quality, the acting, the directing, all those things. I mean, everything you could want in a film. But it was a scary film. Like, I don't watch a ton of horror movies, so watching that one was it's a pretty scary film. I thought, well, this is not going to be scary because it's in a totally different time period, and it really didn't pertain to me so much. And laying awake that night, I thought, man, this was creepy.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about The Witch, because I think it's a unique film. I think um, I really like the film. I think it's a good film. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what makes that film unique, maybe for a
Mm-hmm.
Christian, or regarding eternal consequences. Just a few of the things that make that particular film unique.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, it came out the gate with a lot of critical attention because it was so different from so many other movies. And so the one thing that everybody talked about is that the writer director Robert Eggers was basically went back to a lot of the Puritan writings, Cotton Mather especially, and tried to, as it were, kind of pull the language from that time period out and put it into his period piece horror movie, which is set in this kind of Puritan era. At the very beginning of the film, you see the family leaving what I know to be Plymouth Plantation, which is a basically recreation of the Plymouth colony, heading out into the woods. And as I recall, there's an interview with Robert Eggers and Ari Aster on A24 podcast, and I think he might have said that he actually worked there, or at least he visited there, the Plymouth Plantation. So he had this kind of he's trying to conjure a world, and not just to sort of show, okay, look at these Puritan people struggling with these horrific problems, but to actually make us feel like we're in that time period. So their language reflected with these, archaisms. They seem to be incredibly serious about the possibility of damnation, the devil. They're concerned about this in a way that we are not, and that is highly unusual for Hollywood filmmaking. I mean, the devil often shows up as scary, kills people, does bad stuff in movies, but it's rare that you find sort of, as it were, the devil doing it to people who start out the movie completely terrified of this possibility. Right? They're normally just doing other stuff, and then suddenly this thing catches them blindsides. So, my stories of modern people, they're like us. They're not worried about the devil. These people are, and so we already start off with this healthy fear. and then we just move further and further kind of into the, into danger and darkness. And Eggers himself, he's got a new movie that's coming out called The Lighthouse. Seems like his project is to some degree this kind of historical time machine approach where he's going to, almost teleport us to a different era and give us a sense of what a story would look like in that time. He said he's trying to evoke what you might call like a Puritan's nightmare, and so Cameron actually did most of the writing on the chapter. He deserves most of the credit for this connection. He compares Eggers' movie to Jonathan Edwards' famous "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God." Right? Edwards, by all accounts, not the most exciting orator, but the words of his sermon, cause people to panic and faint and repent. His words deeply connect with people. This possibility of of hell, you're just kind of dangling right over hell. It's nothing but kind of God's arbitrary grace that holds you from this. And so Eggers brings that back to us. He brings it close again, while we're watching the movie, which I think is a really interesting effect. And so, actually, maybe that's one movie I'd say more people should watch. Going back to the first question, I wouldn't mind more people watching that movie because I think that it is a really powerful evocation of an important Christian theme. Jesus himself, probably talks more about damnation than just about anybody else. The movie makes the weight of that available to us again. It gives us a sense of the possibility of damnation and perhaps the lurking dangers of temptations that can lead us there.
Yeah, the movie is rich with themes and even just these connections. You pointed out one of the connections in your article that you wrote with Cameron. Either you or Cameron pointed this out, but I thought it was really neat how they use certain, I guess, inspiration for the imagery or the visuals in the film. So Francisco Goya's black paintings, you see a lot of that imagery in there, and I had no idea. I'm not the most when it comes to art. I'm just new to some of these artists, and so when I started reading Francisco Goya and kind of digging in, it was just really just a bizarre story that he had painted some of these murals on his walls in his home, the black paintings that we have, and then when you see the pictures, I mean they're terrifying. If you see the paintings, they're very they're very creepy. So it was just neat to see the visuals even in the film had relevance. They had meaning. I thought that was cool.
Yeah. Goya, really stands out. There aren't a lot of artists who are notable for their evocation of the horrific. Typically we look to classic painters for their ability to capture beauty and present it to us. And Goya is one of those unique figures. It's the movie. The movie also just conjures to some degree just a lot of the difficulties of pre-modern life, or certainly pre-industrial age life, child death, and to some degree the kind of just the difficulties of life in a really tender way. But it also gets at the temptations of the devil in unexpected ways. You've got Black Phillip the goat. Dost thou want to live deliciously? Is sort of the question. And having lived for an hour and 15 minutes or whatever in Eggers' world, you can sort of feel the temptation of that a bit more. This is these are people that are really dealing with genuine hardship, and so nowadays we're pretty comfortable. We might think, why would anybody want to sell their soul to the devil for a little bit of power and pleasure? We have all the power and pleasure we want. It's often pointed out that, the devil will leave you alone as long as the world and the flesh, are doing their work. It's only when you start resisting them that the devil has to take a hand and interfere. And so you see the devil reaching out, trying to grab these souls.
Right. Yeah. There's a couple of scenes in the film that I just that are iconic. One is the scene where Caleb, the younger boy, is talking with his father about original sin, and he's asking his father some tough questions. I mean, as any boy does at a certain age, you start asking questions about the things you believe. And I thought that was just a really powerful scene. I don't know if you had anything you wanted to say on that scene in particular, if there's anything we could learn from that
Mm-hmm.
scene, but I thought that was one of the most iconic scenes in the film.
Yeah, well, as one would expect, this Puritan folk do take, sin seriously, really, genuinely see all people as being affected by the fall, which is a helpful reminder. I mean, there is a sense in which that we are encountering still like an alien world, um, and so it can be somewhat easy to look at the movie and say, well, you know that's them then, dealing with that. Part of what makes The Exorcist interesting, is that it's a much more modern movie, which you have a priest, is struggling with that, right? So everybody's struggling with doubt, and so the kind of doubt itself, which is something that's not, in a sense, available to the characters in The Witch, is at the very forefront of a movie like The Exorcist, which is like people are still struggling with their faith, and as modern people, that tends to be our situation a bit more. We kind of, we're less likely to go along with these sort of traditional teachings and think, no, maybe those things aren't true. But what's interesting about horror movies very often is that they are, in a sense, kind of conservative, which they're sort of, as it were, bringing back the old things and challenging us with the notion, for instance, you think you're so morally good and you've got everything figured out. Actually, you don't. Like, look at how easily your world can be exploded. Look at how bad you really are on the inside. And so there is a kind of a hellfire preacher quality to almost all horror movies, at least ones that are any good.
Right, yeah. Well, one of the things that, and another scene in the film that I just thought was powerful, the film doesn't really offer a lot of hope for this particular family. There's, a lot going on that they just have no control over. And they're praying, God save me, and, I'm paraphrasing obviously, but they're praying these deep prayers of repentance. They start to wonder, is there something wrong with me? So there's this scene where the mother is there and the boy is in this sort of trance, and she looks up at her husband and she says, I just want to go home. And of course they've been separated from their home. And you wrote a little bit about the scene, and you and Cameron, and in the article you both wrote that this is a deeply humane moment in a film that often feels strange and remote. Never do we forget that these are real flesh and blood people struggling to make the best of their circumstances. Though it abounds in startling imagery and occult rituals, The Witch offers none of the convenient escapism most of us expect from our entertainment. It's a film that inspires fear, revulsion, and yes, horror. So I think just that is often representative of reality for some people who it seems like pray, God, deliver me from this, and it doesn't happen. So maybe you could expound on that a little bit. How does this scene or this film reflect a realistic experience when it comes to tragedy and suffering?
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously the best person who ever lived, Jesus Christ himself, prayed to be delivered from the thing he was about to face, and the answer was no, right? And so if anyone's a follower of Jesus, they shouldn't expect that they will not suffer, but at best that their sufferings might be made like Christ's, meaningful and ultimately redeemable. That's that's our great hope. But it's the movie's grounded in a reality that most people throughout history and most people throughout the world do experience, which is very real, danger, very real discomforts, very real difficulty. Though, of course, the irony is that it's actually people in those situations who are often kind of better able, as it were, to kind of find hope and comfort in the gospel than people like us who live in very comfortable situations. And so undoubtedly, part of the allure of horror movies has to do with the fact that we are actually detached in some way from the real situation in which most people throughout the history of the world lived. Right? Infant mortality rate, throughout most of the world, um, I don't know, somewhere around 50%, um, maybe a little better than that, depending on circumstance. I'm a father of four kids. I never lost a kid. To me, it seems utterly devastating and life destroying. Most people have actually, who ever lived, have experienced this. At least a good proportion of people have experienced this, and so there is a sense in which kind of horror movies, as it were, actually bring us a lot closer to the material reality of most of our human brothers and sisters who have lived throughout time. And so I think that partly we're hungry to know what those sorts of experiences are like, because the problems that we deal with are somebody not liking our post on Facebook and wondering why they didn't, or not getting the kind of the job that we wanted while we're still materially very comfortable, or just kind of having anxiety about our appearance. I'm not trying to belittle the problems that modern people face, but there is a sense in which we're we live in the most materially comfortable time ever, but yet people are also incredibly anxious, depressed, dealing with a lot of psychological difficulty. And so, I think there is a kind of, as it were, a missing piece for a lot of, modern Western people, which is a deeper understanding of what suffering is actually like, what sort of the real difficulties people face, what true horrors can look like. And so we partly turn to, I think, these movies to attempt to understand. Now, that's not to say that's the best. People still do, of course, face different sorts of horrors. There's all sorts of social, emotional, physical abuse that still happens, and very posh McMansions, neighborhoods all around us, and not to dismiss those things, but it is. I think it is the case that there is a kind of renewed fascination, as it were, partly because horrors, as it were, kind of shock us back, as it were, into an understanding of what a lot of life really is like.
Yeah, it seems like horror movies, like we said earlier, it's that friend that you don't want him to say anything, but he's probably good to keep around because he's honest and straightforward. Before I get you out of here, just a couple other things. Number one, are there, we've mentioned a few, but any quality horror films that you would recommend anyone? And then secondly, is there a place that anyone who's, let's say someone's listening to this and they've just enjoyed this talk and they want to go a little deeper, can find you and Cameron and any future work you may be doing on horror out there? So just those two questions.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, horror movie recommendations. Well, it all depends on what your taste is, or what, where you are. I think that a lot of times the best thing to do is to just do a little bit of traveling back into the past if you're sort of uncertain about, content. One nice thing about classic movies is that they, have a little stricter guidelines, and, maybe you're going to be a little less scary out the gate. So I do love Alfred Hitchcock. I think Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho is a landmark movie. And it's brilliantly made. It's, interesting in its structure. Hitchcock, you can sort of feel Hitchcock's cinematic mind at work throughout the thing. And, I think it's a interesting movie to watch and to think about, which is why Hitchcock is always so wonderful. So you can't really go wrong there. If you like Hitchcock, you can go on and watch The Birds, which almost feels like a kind of a meta meditation on horror movies, because birds aren't scary, but the birds in this movie are attacking everybody, and so he's sort of playing, as it were, almost with the kind of conventions of this sort of nature gone wild, horror movie genre, and so those are quite good. I mean, of course, there are some longstanding classics of horror filmmaking. So The Shining is arguably one of the best horror movies ever made. It's an interesting film. Stephen King is a writer that I respect a lot. He writes powerfully and but also very thoughtfully. There's a lot of humanity in his writing, and so that movie made by Kubrick, one of our great filmmakers, and that book by Stephen King, one of our great popular novelists are a lot of, they're interesting to read and to consider. So if people have already watched through all of those, then you can actually read Cameron McAllister. He does a lot of writing on Christ and pop culture, and he writes about horror movies, especially some contemporary horror movies. So you can go read his work there, and he'll be kind of commending different things to you. And so folks might want to check that out. I've got a book called The Poetics of Evil. The last chapter deals with horror, but it's expensive. It's an academic book. It's very, small print, large words. And if somebody wants to go really deep, they can, read through the whole book to get to the last chapter on horror.
Right. Well, man, I've enjoyed talking to you, man. This has been fun. You had something else to add?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And of course, in a few years, Cameron and I will have a book out from Lexham Press called Cinema Inferno, How Horror Movies Can Save Your Soul. And so we're working on that right now.
Man, can't wait to read that. That sounds so interesting. Just looking forward to it, man. This whole talk has been fun. This has probably been one of the most unique podcasts that we've done, because I know that there are people out there that enjoy horror films, and they may not be enjoying them because they're dark or something's wrong with them or they're weird. They just enjoy film as a whole. A lot of times it's people who enjoy film, and there's a culture out there that enjoys particularly the genre of horror. And I think it's important for Christians to talk about, because many of us have either seen horror films or we actually really like horror films, and maybe we don't tell everybody, but it's really a unique style of film, and these are some good reasons why I think you can enjoy that without feeling like that, feeling ashamed of that, I guess. This is a good reason to enjoy horror films, and I think they do have positive qualities to offer. And if you don't enjoy them, like you said in the beginning, you don't enjoy them. That's okay. But if you do, these are some good reasons to enjoy the genre itself. So. Yeah.
And you obviously want to keep balancing that with, beautiful, thoughtful, articulate art. These are the, you make sure you eat your veggies as well. And as well as sipping the interesting poison of horror movies. I would just, I do think that, like, for people who really want to dig deeper and understand culture, at least being aware of what's going on in horror is valuable. Not everybody is called to that. I don't think my grandma, my faithful, old kind of grandma, needs to know what's going on in horror. But for someone who's really trying to kind of consider culture, understand it, and interact with it, there's a lot of value to thinking through these issues, and a lot of outreach potential.
Absolutely. Well, we saw the outreach potential, and just the example you gave, that's a great example. So absolutely. Well, thank you for doing this with us, man. I really appreciate it. And just been a pleasure having you on.
Okay. Yeah, glad to do it. Thanks, Clark.
No problem. Hey, man, we're done recording, but